right here. How can you follow a book that condones slavery? How would you respond to that? Well, first of all, when you and I think of slavery, you and I immediately think of 18th and 19th century American race-based chattel slavery, which began with human trafficking, kidnapping, and it was slavery for life. Now, we can all agree that that was a sin in our nation's history, and it was wrong, awful, terrible. It was a great injustice, and it was very displeasing to God. But that was not the same thing as what Paul's talking about in 1 Timothy 6. First century Roman slavery was more often indentured servanthood. It was the kind of last resort that someone would choose if they were in financial trouble as a way of staying afloat in life. It was kind of like the ancient version of declaring bankruptcy or chapter 13. You could sell yourself into slavery if you were really desperate. Now, in the first century Roman culture, slaves were not segregated from society like they were here in America. And from a financial standpoint, slaves actually made the same wages as a free person. And during their time of service, they could gain quite a bit of capital for themselves to the point where they could buy themselves out. And so very few first century slaves were slaves for life. Most of them received their manumission papers, their freedom papers, within a decade or so. This was very different. Now, was that system misused at times? Yes, just as all systems are misused at times, including systems in our day, by the way. And was the Bible misused to condone 19th century slavery? Yes, it was, but that was a perversion of the Bible. That was not a proper use of the Bible, and that makes all the difference. Now, let me ask you this question. If the Bible is such a regressive and oppressive book, how come the primary narrative of the Bible in the Old Testament is about the freeing of slaves? The Exodus story is the story of the Old Testament. And how come there's New Testament books like Philemon, which call for the freedom of certain slaves? And how come the abolitionists of the 19th century were men of integrity like William Wilberforce, who had a deep evangelical Christian faith? And how come 50 years ago, when MLK Jr. led the charge against segregation in this country and stood up against systemic racism, how come he didn't choose to throw the Bible out? How come he said things like, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream"? That's quoting the book of Amos. The reason is because the Bible actually has great news for anyone in oppression. Slavery was a universal sociological phenomenon across human history. It was in all cultures. But it was the Judeo-Christian ethic that paved the way for the elimination of slavery. Now, I know this is a difficult issue, but before you reject the Bible, just consider that it might not be teaching what you think it's teaching.